Welcome to week 8 all. Dr. JC here. Crazy to think, but we're at the midpoint of the semester already, so stay alert, stay alive, as that old military saw goes. 8 more weeks, hang in there, keep doing your work, you guys will be good to go. As it relates to week 8 here specifically, we're going to break this lecture into 3 parts. We'll look at the Vikings first, then move on to the Franks, this Frankish Empire with important individuals like Clovis and Charlemagne or Charlemagne. And in the final component or lecture of this 3-part series in 8, we're going to talk about feudalism as well. I want you to think in broader terms, though, if there was a broader umbrella for all 3 of these. All 3 of these lectures will tie into the re-emergence of Western Europe. As we start to see the Byzantine Empire begin to decline slowly, we'll see power shift back away from Constantinople back to Rome. So just as in the wake of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, we saw a power shift from Rome to Constantinople, the same thing's going to occur in this next cycle of events in history, where we see power move from Constantinople back to Rome. That's the sort of broad overview for week 8 ahead. Let's jump right into the Viking lands next. Now, when we're talking about the Vikings, and no, this isn't the folks that wear purple in Minnesota, this is a different set of Vikings. These Vikings happen to refer to the individuals that people the lands of modern-day nation-states of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And I want you to take this into consideration immediately. There is no such thing as a Viking state. There's no capital there. While they will view the Vestfold, which is the western part of the Oslo Fjord today, as sort of their homeland, there is no central Viking state. Therefore, Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, all these individuals, while considered Vikings, didn't necessarily care for one another either. Do keep that in mind. As a way to portray the differences in Vikings, you can look at the map on this slide. Norwegians themselves are going to tend to move more westwardly in their migratory and or invasion routes. They'll move into the Orkney and Shetland Islands, skirt the top of what's Scotland today, move into Ireland. They'll also move west via Iceland to Greenland and eventually even into Newfoundland. Yes, Vikings will discover the Americas fully 5 centuries before some dude named Columbus. The Vikings were here first. We'll talk about that later. How about the Danes themselves? The Danes were going to move more into England itself, parts of what would be modern-day Netherlands and the north of France. As for Swedes, the Swedes are going to move through the Baltic and tend to move more to the east. Swedes are going to move themselves through Russia and even into Islamic lands. Yes, there is written and archaeological evidence of Vikings being part of the Byzantine Empire, part of the Byzantine inner circle. They're known warriors, known for their fighting, skill, bravery, and high ability to trade. Hence the broad sweep and reach of these individuals. So we'll talk more about the Vikings themselves next. So who were these people that history has long remembered as savages and barbarians? Well, if we're talking about the age of the Vikings, we're talking about roughly 800 to about 1050, roughly about 250 years. Big thing to remember, however, about the Vikings is not that they were savage peoples, brutal peoples. Yes, they were fierce warriors to be sure, but we're talking about individuals that had advanced engineering, advanced ability to bend and work metal, advanced ability to show their individual craftsmanship. These were anything but brutish people. These were actually very advanced peoples. We'll talk about them. One of the Vikings is not that goofy looking dude at the bottom left hand corner. That actually happens to be me. And yes, I allowed somebody to take that picture, ridiculously touristy picture, probably after too many Carlsbergs of mine. We'll leave that story for another day. In all reality and all seriousness, I want to talk specifically about the Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, these Vikings. While clearly an agrarian people, like most others, they farm, their proximity to the sea would lead them to be master mariners. In fact, I want you to think of the Vikings as master shipbuilders, especially these Norsemen or Northmen, the Norwegians especially. As it relates to the actual engineering, construction, and design of these ships, I'll leave that to your own research, and I highly recommend you guys do it. I mean, it's unbelievable the way these guys were able to design these ships. These ships were not only able to go up rivers because they had a very shallow draft, they were able to also go in the open ocean. I mean, we're talking about ships that are going to sail from Bergen in Norway today to the Shetland Islands in modern day Scotland in like 48 hours. So they're going across the North Sea. And if anybody's been on the North Sea, it gets pretty damn rough. It does. So it's pretty amazing that the construction of these ships was such that they could be worthy to sail the open ocean, yet shallow enough drafts designed where they could go up rivers like the Thames into London, like the Seine into Paris. Unbelievable design. To include the artwork, I mean, you can see the woodworking on these ships too. It's amazing. Do research it. It's pretty cool. In addition to the naval engineering, their residential construction was pretty interesting as well. This is a pretty good example of renewable design, I should think, here in these Viking longhouses. Not going to get into detail how they were constructed. Again, you guys can go ahead and research this. Pretty amazing. I'm not even going to get into, unfortunately, talking about advanced metallurgy as it relates to the Vikings too. For anyone interested, I'd ask that you research this Ulfbert sword. Ulfbhert, Ulfbert sword. The tensile strength of the metal is approaching crucible steel. These guys are creating this in the 900s and thousands. Pretty crazy. So again, advanced nature of these people is unbelievable. What I do want to focus on, rather than the sort of social side of things here, and I could spend 16 weeks talking about the Vikings. I love it. I love the Viking lands. Would encourage everybody to go into the Nordic states. It's an incredible region. But rather than continue to go on, I've got to focus specifically on the impact of the Vikings on this reemergence of Western Europe. While I would like to spend time talking about the Vikings' impact on all Europeans, I'm going to focus, for the sake of this lecture and the sake of brevity and time, to look specifically on England and the Vikings' impact on England. Because Vikings began to raid into lands in the north of England, like at Lindisfarne, that famed sort of first Viking raid, they would focus specifically too on religious institutions. These were low impact targets with great riches, right? The Catholic Church had much money and generally were defended by monks who were busy copying religious texts, maybe popping popcorn or making mead and beer. Great endeavors in my purview, but easy targets, so to speak. And the Vikings would begin to raid willy-nilly, meaning that there really wasn't any pattern or set time that the Vikings would strike. These are guys that would just seem to appear out of the mist, come hit you, take what you had, and leave. It was really crazy, and not exactly the best way to live if you were in English society at the time. So what it's going to force peoples to do, different ethnic peoples to do in England, is start to come together for a common defense, and they will rally under this king called King Alfred. Because this is more the story of the Vikings than it is the English per se, for those interested, I would ask that you research King Alfred and the impact the Vikings had on him. I'll give you the Cliff Notes version in some ways here. What it's going to force the English to do is come together in a common defense. They're going to start to put together organized militias throughout towns, and they're also going to begin to build a navy. This is an advanced warning net. The best way to go ahead and prepare for defense is to know when the Vikings are coming. And the best way to do that is to set forth your own navy. This is then therefore going to force the English to begin to build a national navy. And it will be the English Navy then through the latter part of the 1700s and much of the 1800s that will come to dominate the seas. Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves. Britons never, never will be slaves, as the music goes. Their maritime tradition in some ways can be linked directly to defense of the Vikings. Therefore, the Viking impact on England is going to have an impact on global history, to be sure. Pretty amazing. In fact, as it relates to naval tradition and maritime tradition and history, the Vikings are going to provide a little bit of this old tavern talk. And that tavern talk in the age of exploration or sail, once we get to the 1400s and we start talking about those dumb things we learned in grade school, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Somebody shoot me. When we're talking about that age of exploration, though, we're talking about almost the 1500s. If you look on this map here, you can see Eric the Red, the Leif Eriksons of the world. These guys are sailing to the New World 500 years before we start hearing about or reading about the Christopher Columbus's founding the New World. So in that 400-500 year gap, stories emerge. So as we hit this age of sail, the Christopher Columbuses, when they're young boys, they're hearing about individuals that maybe had sailed to this new land or new world, and it did provide extra impetus to want to go west, to want to shatter this old paradigm where the world was flat. And everyone knew the world was flat, right? Until somebody that sailed west decided to come back. So this tavern talk then, the Vikings are going to help create that, and it's going to spur this age of exploration or age of sail later for Europeans. While I would love to continue on all day long talking about the Vikings, regrettably, at least for me, I have to go ahead and begin to start to transition into the Frankish lands next. Therefore, we'll provide a little summary as it relates to the Vikings here. The Vikings, as mentioned at the outset, are different. They're not all the same. So you really have to look at the differences between the Norwegians, the Danes, and the Swedes, because at times they will be fighting one another for control of lands throughout the Baltic, throughout Scandinavia. All of them, however, were a maritime people. All of them were fiercely, fiercely, fiercely brutal in battle. They were. But that does not mean they were a brutish people, because they weren't. In fact, they were a very advanced people. They wanted to focus on engineering and trade. Does that sound much different than any of us today? It isn't. And they did have a major impact on Europe and the trajectory of Europe. They will lead to the unification of England in many ways. In some ways, you could make an argument that they're going to do the same sort of thing in France and Russia. We'll talk about those two later. So huge impact that these folks have, to include the fact, they just found the New World like 500 years before Columbus. That's no big deal, right? Unbelievable, their engineering, their seamanship, their mastery of the oceans, and mastery of all aspects of society, to include metalworking and other aspects of life. So if you get a chance, I'm telling you guys, you gotta go to these lands. They're really cool. If you happen to go to Norway, shake the hand of a troll. You gotta meet the trolls there. They're good luck. And as a bonus to those of us that might not have command of a lot of different foreign languages, the folks in Scandinavia and the larger Nordic world, they speak English better than we do. Can't make it up. Really cool place. Recommend you guys go if you get the opportunity. So, regrettably, again, I got to call goodbye to the Vikings here as we get ready to move on to the Franks next. Dr. JC out from the Vikings, Lecture 8, Part 1.